Eat something, yeah? Tessa's voice shakes me out of my vigil. I look away from the lake to see her holding out a piece of bread and cheese, gesturing for me to take it. I should be hungry. I've only eaten half an apple since my encounter with the strange government agent last night. But somehow the bread and cheese, still fresh from the shop where Tess had traded a few precious notes for it, doesn't seem tempting. I take it anyway. Far be it from me to waste perfectly good food, especially when we should be saving everything we have for plague meds. Tess and I are sitting in the sand underneath a pier at the part of the lake that crosses into our sector. We keep ourselves pressed as closely against the side of the bank as we can, so idle soldiers and drunk workers above can't see us past all the grass and rocks. We blend into the shadows. From where we sit, we can taste the salt in the air and see the lights of downtown Los Angeles reflected on the water. Ruins of older buildings dot the lake, buildings abandoned by business owners and residents when the floodwaters rose. Giant water wheels and turbines churn along the water's edge behind the veils of smoke. This is probably my favorite view from our shabby, beautiful little lake sector. I take that back. It's my favorite and least favorite view, because while the electric lights of downtown make for some nice sightseeing, I can also see the trial stadium looming off in the east. You still have time, Tess says to me. She scoots close enough for me to feel her bare arm against mine. Her hair smells like bread and cinnamon from the shop. Probably a month or more. We'll find plague medicine before then, I'm sure of it. For a girl with no family and no home, Tess is surprisingly optimistic. I try to smile for her sake. Maybe, I say. Maybe the hospital will let its guard down after a couple of weeks. But in my heart, I know better. Earlier in the day, I risked a peek at my mother's house. The strange X still marked the door. My mother and John seemed okay, at least strong enough to stand and walk around. But this time Eden was lying in bed with a cloth on his forehead. Even from a distance, I could tell he'd already lost some weight. His skin looked wan, and his voice sounded weak and hoarse. When I met John later behind our house, he told me that Eden hadn't eaten since the last time I came by. I reminded John to stay out of Eden's room when he could. Who knows how this cracked plague is spreading? John warned me not to pull any more stunts in case get myself killed. I had to laugh at that. John won't ever say it to my face, but I know that I am Eden's only chance. The plague might end Eden's life before he even gets to take the trial. Maybe it's a blessing in disguise. Eden would never have to stand outside our door on his 10th birthday, waiting for a bus to take him to the trial stadium. He'd never have to follow dozens of other children up the stadium stairs and into the inner circle, or run laps while trial admins study his breathing and posture, or answer pages and pages of stupid multiple choice questions, or survive an interview in front of a half circle of impatient officials. He he'd never have to wait in one of several groups afterward, unsure of which groups would return home and which group would be sent off to so-called labor camps. I don't know. If worst came to worst, maybe the plague would be a more merciful way to go. Eden always gets sick, I say after a while. I take a large bite out of the bread and cheese. He almost died once when he was a baby. He got some kind of pox and had fevers and rashes and cried nonstop for a week. The soldiers came close to marking our door, but it obviously wasn't the plague, and no one else seemed to have it. I shake my head. John never got sick. Tess doesn't smile this time. Poor Eden. After a pause, she continues. I was pretty sick when you first met me. Remember how grimy I looked? Suddenly, I feel guilty for talking about my problems so much over the last few days. At least I have a family to worry about. I put an arm around her shoulder. Yeah, you looked pretty awful. Tess laughs, but her eyes stay focused on the downtown lights. She leans her head on my shoulder. It's the way she's leaned against me ever since the very first week I knew her, when I'd spotted her in an alley in Nima sector. I still don't know what made me stop and talk to her that afternoon. Maybe the heat had made me softer. Maybe I was just in a good mood because I'd found a restaurant that had thrown out an entire day's worth of old sandwiches. Hey, I called out to her. Two more heads popped up out of the garbage bin, but I flinched in surprise. Two of them, an older woman and a teenage boy, immediately scrambled out of the mess and ran down the alley. The third, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, stayed where she was, trembling, when she saw me. She was skinny as a rail, with a tattered shirt and trousers. Her hair was short and blunt, cut off abruptly right below her chin, and the red in the sunlight. I waited for a moment, not wanting to scare her like I had the others. Hey, I said again. Mind if I join you? She stared back at me without a word. I could barely make out her face because of all the soot on it. When she didn't reply, I shrugged and started walking toward her. I don't have a home. You don't? Where are your parents? She shook her head again. I sighed and dropped my canvas bag to the ground, then held out a hand to her. Come on, I said. You don't want two infected knees. I'll help clean them up, and then you can be on your way again. You can have some of my food, too. Pretty good deal, right? It took me a long time to get her to put her hand in mine. Okay, she whispered, so softly that I could barely hear her. That night, we camped out behind a pawn shop that had a pair of old chairs and a ripped up couch lying in its alley. I cleaned the girl's knees with alcohol stolen from a bar, letting her bite down on a rag so she wouldn't shriek and draw attention to us. Other than when I was tending to her scrapes, she never let me get near her. Whenever my hand accidentally brushed her hair or bumped her arm, she would flinch as if burned by steam from a kettle. Finally, I gave up trying to talk to her. I let her have the couch, while I laid out my shirt as a pillow and tried to get comfortable on the pavement. If you want to leave in the morning, just go, I told her. You don't have to wake me up or say goodbye or anything. My eyelids were growing heavy, but she stayed wide awake, staring unblinkingly at me. Even as I fell asleep, she was still there in the morning. She followed me around as I scavenged in garbage bins, picking out old clothes and edible bits of leftover food. I tried asking her to leave. I even tried shouting at her. An orphan would be a huge inconvenience. But although I made her cry a few times, when I looked over my shoulder, she'd still be there, trailing me a short distance away. 2 nights later, we sat together by a crude fire. She finally spoke to me. My name is Tess, she whispered. Then she studied my face, like she wanted to guess my reaction. I only shrugged. Good to know, I said. And that was that.
Tess bolts out of her sleep. Her arm whacks my head. Ouch, I mutter as I rub my forehead. Pain runs through my healing arm, and I hear the silver bullets Tess took from my clothes clink together in my pocket. If you wanted to wake me up, you could have just tapped me. She holds a finger to her lips. Now I'm alert. We're still sitting underneath the pier, but it's probably a couple of hours before dawn, and the skyline has already gone dark. Several antique street lamps lining the edge of the lake. I glance at Tess. Her eyes glint in the darkness. Do you hear something? She whispers. I frown. Usually I can hear something suspicious before Tess does, but this time I hear nothing at all. We both stay still for a long moment. I hear the occasional lap of waves, the churning sound of metal pushing water, now and then a passing car. I look at Tess again. What did you hear the first time? It sounded like something gurgling, she whispers. Before I can think much about it, I hear footsteps and then a voice approaching the pier above us. We both shrink farther into the shadows. It's a man's voice, and his footsteps sound oddly heavy. I realize a second later the man is walking in step with someone else, a pair of street police. I push myself farther back against the bank, and some of the loose dirt and rocks give away. They roll silently down into the sand. I keep pushing until my back hits a surface that's hard and smooth. Tess does the same. There's something brewing, one of the police says. Plagues popped up in the Zane sector this time. Their footsteps clomp overhead, and I see their figures walk along the beginning of the pier. Off in the distance, the first signs of light are turning the horizon a murky gray. I've never heard of the plague showing up there. Must be a stronger strain. What are they going to do? I try to hear what the other policeman has to say, but by now the two have walked far enough that their voices have turned to murmurs. I take a deep breath. The Zane sector is a good 30 miles away from here. But what if the strange red mark on my mother's door means that they're infected with this new strain? And what will the elector do about it? Day, Tess whispers. I look at her. She turns against the bank so that her back now faces out toward the lake. She points at the deep indent we've made in the bank. When I turn around, I see what she's pointing to. The hard surface I'd had my back against is actually a sheet of metal. When I brush away more of the rocks and dirt, I see that the metal is lodged deep in the bank, so that it's probably what's holding the bank up in the first place. I squint at the surface. Tess looks at me. It's hollow. Hollow? I put my ear against the ice-cold metal. A wave of noise hits me, the gurgling and hissing sound that Tess heard earlier. This isn't just a metal structure to hold up the lake's shores. When I pull away from it, I look closer at the metal. I notice symbols carved on its surface. One of these is the Republic's flag, imprinted faintly against the metal. Another is a small red number.